Ew, are these expired? You know that stash of art supplies you have? The ones you've been meaning to use but never seem to have time for? Well, as it turns out, art supplies don't last forever. In this video, we'll talk about more than a dozen of the most common art supplies on the market, how long they're expected to last, signs that your supplies might be past their prime, and most importantly, how to properly store your art supplies to make the most of their shelf life. I will have timestamps below in the description if you'd prefer to jump around to a specific product. Quick disclaimer, this will be a general guide, something I've compiled from many trusted resources, but individual experiences may vary, of course, especially because not all brands are the same, and economy grade materials can differ greatly from professional grade materials. And keep in mind, I'll be talking about opened art supplies. Unopened packaging will likely keep for even longer. Stick around to the end of the video because I will have a bonus tip that I think you'll find helpful. First up, let's jump into some watercolors. And by the way, these time frames are for the supplies themselves and not for any finished artwork that you may have made using these supplies. So, watercolors, surprisingly, these paints can last decades. Even cheap, low-quality palettes can last for years. Watch out for mold growth, bad smells, and drastic changes in color. These might be signs that it's time to say goodbye to your paints. If you notice cracking in your palette, all is not lost. You might be able to revive them by slowly adding water. Watercolors like to be kept in cool, dry storage. Extreme temperatures should be avoided. And on to number 2, we have gouache. Gouache can last anywhere between 5 to 20 years, depending on the brand, quality of materials, and proper storage. Watch out for weird smells, mold, drastic color changes, and extreme dryness. Ooh, did that last sentence just sound a lot like a prescription drug commercial? Yikes. Anyways, like watercolors, you can revive gouache by slowly mixing it in water. But unlike watercolors, if it's too dried out, you can certainly give it a go with water, but you might be out of luck. Some artists say that by adding a few drops of gum arabic, you might also be able to bring back that really smooth, rich texture. As far as storage, stick with a cool, dry area, avoid extreme temperatures, no direct sunlight, and keep gouache in its original container or in an airtight palette. Number 3, acrylic paint. So acrylic paints can last anywhere between 2 and 10 years, and from what I've seen, these craft bottles don't last as long as the slightly more expensive acrylic paints that tend to come in tubes. Be on the lookout for mold, smell, color changes, and especially changes in consistency. They might be lumpy or rubbery, or you'll notice separation even after mixing. I've definitely seen this separation problem with my older craft acrylics. It seems to be more prevalent with the specialty paints, like metallic, glitter, glow-in-the-dark, and I always shake these ones for an extra minute to make sure they're well mixed. Store all of your acrylic paints out of extreme temps and sunlight, and I would recommend wiping them down on the top before putting them away. Sometimes I get lazy and I forget to do this step, and what happens is the paint dries on top, and then you're not getting that tight seal on the lid when you close it. Either a damp sponge or a paper towel will work just fine. Up next, oil paints. Quite possibly the longest lasting art medium, at least on today's list, at 10 to 40 years. Be aware of rancid smells, paint that's much thicker than normal, paint that is refusing to blend, lumpy, or if there is a layer of oil that just won't mix. Store oil paints in a cool, dry place, away from humidity and extreme temperatures. No direct sunlight, and keep them in their original tubes, sealed tightly in containers or pallets. I don't have much experience with oil paints beyond my research, so if anyone would like to add any tips, go ahead and throw them in the comments. Number 5 on today's list is colored pencils. Expect 2 to 5 years for economy grade and 5 to 10 years for professional grade. When these supplies have passed their peak, you'll notice that they're breaking easily, they won't sharpen, they're brittle, faded, and the marks on your paper will be very crumbly. Simple storage works for colored pencils. Just find a cool, dry location away from extreme temps and direct sunlight. And next up, we have charcoals, lasting anywhere between 5 and 10 years. And really the only issue that comes about as they age is a lot of crumbling and breaking. But of course, this can make it difficult to create a piece of art if everything is falling apart in your hands. Cool, dry storage once again, no extreme temps or direct sunlight, and very important for charcoals, try to keep them away from humidity or any type of moisture. Soft pastels. No surprise here, but the chart I put together for soft pastels is going to look a lot like charcoals. In fact, the only real difference I'm noticing is to watch out for major changes in color. Everything else seems to be the same. You might notice that they're brittle or overly crumbly. Oh, and professional or artist grade can actually last for decades. Pretty good. As far as storage, you know the drill. Find a cool, dry space with no extreme temps or direct sunlight, and avoid moisture and humidity. Moving on to number 8 on our art supply list, we have oil pastels, which are expected to last between 5 and 10 years. As they go bad, you might notice an extra waxy, almost slimy texture. You might see a film covering them, and they'll be crumbly. To avoid the dreaded slime, you'll want cool, dry storage, no excessive temps or direct sunlight. By the way, I didn't do a separate chart for crayons because the details are pretty much the same as oil pastels, except they'll probably start to go bad a few years sooner. Everything else was the same. Number 9, alcohol markers. We're looking at 2 to 3 years economy grade and 5 or more for artist grade. If they do go bad, don't worry, you aren't likely to see your pens explode, sending rancid slime across your craft room. Nope, they simply won't work. The marks will be inconsistent and faded. Some artists say that you might be able to revive them with isopropyl alcohol of 70% or higher. Just add a few drops, shake them up thoroughly to mix. And it makes sense that this would work, but I haven't tested it myself, so if you have, please let us know in the comments. Storage looks similar to the other art supplies, with the addition of storing them horizontally, not vertically. Acrylic paint markers. An example would be these very popular Posca markers. According to general consensus, they are said to last 2 to 5 years, although most artists say that the paint inside actually runs out well before that. Signs that your acrylic paint markers have gone bad? They will stop working. The marks will be inconsistent and faded. And if you feel like you haven't used them enough to run out of paint, but you are having these problems, do try to revive them by shaking them and pressing down on the tip, or by soaking the tip in water for a couple of minutes. You can also run the tip under the tap as long as you aren't washing any paint into your drain. Generally, the problem comes down to issues with the tip, because we know from the beginning of this video that the acrylic paint itself can last for many years. Storage suggestions for acrylic paint markers are the same as the alcohol markers, including the very important horizontal storage. Next up, we have number 11, fineliner pens. And for anyone who uses microns or a similar pen, this will not come as a surprise, but you'll be lucky if they last over 3 years. Though oil-based pens will often last longer than the water-based, which do tend to dry out fairly quickly. If your pens are not working, leaving faded or inconsistent lines, or if they're no longer gliding smoothly over the paper, well, not only is this very annoying, but it might also be time to say farewell. Store your fineliner pens horizontally or tip facing up to avoid ink pooling in the tip. Make sure you put those caps on tight and keep them in a cool, dark place away from sunlight. And here's a little take it or leave it suggestion, but I'll sometimes keep my old pens for a while because when they're kind of weak and just making light marks, you can use them for shading. And so what I do is I just make sure and put some tape on the end so I know which pen is the old one. It'll save you some frustration, trust me. On to number 12, stamp ink pads. Now they will generally last 2 to 3 years, though there are so many different types of ink pads available these days that it's really difficult to know exactly how long they'll last. If you're getting inconsistent stamping results, faded impressions, or if your stamp pad feels unusually sticky, it might be going bad. Re-inking might be an option depending on the brand, but I'd also like to share something that was mentioned on Reddit. So someone suggested using a misting bottle full of distilled water. Make sure it's distilled because you don't want any of that funky gunk from the tap water in your stamp pad. And then just gently mist the pad. This will not work if your stamp pad is completely dried out, of course, but it might revive it if it's just somewhat dry and you're getting those faded impressions. As far as storage, we're looking at cool, dry storage away from extreme temps. And very important, make sure that the lid is on tightly. Maybe even put your stamp pads in a Ziploc bag if you know you're not going to use them on a regular basis. We have just 2 more art supplies to cover. We're almost done. Number 13 is decoupage mediums or sealers. This would be a product like Mod Podge and similar multi-use gluey guys. And I guess they're only expected to last 6 months to 2 years. Though in the past, I have definitely kept these around for more than 2 years. If I'm being honest though, I was beginning to see the lumps and clumps and the overly thick consistency mentioned in column 2. The product won't work like it should if you can't brush on a thin, even layer. Sometimes if thickness is the only problem, you might be able to add some water, assuming that your product is water-based. But once the lumps and clumps begin to appear, it might be too late to revive it. Also watch out for unusual smells. Recommended storage for decoupage mediums is a cool, dark place away from those high and low temps. Avoid humidity. It's best to keep them in their original containers, always upright. And remember when we talked about the craft acrylics and we were using a damp sponge or paper towel to clean the lid before closing? Well, the same goes for these bottles. If you don't have a good tight seal, your product won't last. Or you might discover that you've glued it shut. Show of hands, who's done that at least once? I know I have. Number 14, last but not least, art paper. You might be interested to know that with proper storage, all of that art paper you've been holding onto can last decades. Yippee! I'm not going to cover any of the handmade small batch papers made from seeds or rice, none of those, maybe in a later video. But for now, I'm just covering the standard art papers that you can buy from most craft stores or on Amazon. Watercolor paper, mixed media, sketchbook paper, and so on. Watch out for brittle edges, warping and curling. Also look for yellowing, discolored paper. This can be kept at bay with cool, dry storage away from extreme temperatures. Avoid direct sunlight, moisture, and humidity. Humidity is not friends with your art paper. I don't care what it tries to tell you. They are not friends. Humidity is not to be trusted. Are we clear? Store your paper flat in the original packaging or in acid-free folders or sleeves. I was unaware of the acid-free thing, so that's good to know. If you do find that some of your art supplies are no longer usable, be sure to look into how to properly dispose of them. Not everything can be tossed into the trash. You probably noticed that many art supplies have similar recommendations when it comes to storage. So, you might consider a closet or a cabinet to house all of your precious supplies. Guys, your art supplies are a lot like vampires. Direct sunlight can be very damaging. If this isn't an option, storing in a closet or a cabinet, maybe consider using airtight containers, especially for your pens, markers, and stamp pads. Slide that container under a table to shield it from the sun. Large Ziploc bags can also work and they can be reused for many years. Just make sure to push out as much air as you can before zipping and locking. Well, if you're still here, you made it to the bonus tip. I'm a mom with 2 kids, so over the years we have lost a number of lids to the great abyss. You know, that place where lost socks go. So I found that by taking a small strip of saran wrap and some painter's tape, I've been able to avoid throwing away many lidless items. So what I do is I wrap it snugly around the tip, secure it with one piece of tape, and then if needed, I use a second piece at the very end to hold it in place. Press down and seal to keep the air out. It won't last forever, but I have been using this container of glue for at least 6 months, and it's still working fine. I reuse the same plastic wrap each time, but I do sometimes need to replace the bottom painter's tape. And if you're using this on a marker, just make sure the plastic wrap around the tip is quite snug. You'll get at least a couple more uses out of it. If you were surprised or concerned by the shelf life of any of the art supplies mentioned, I have one piece of advice for you. Use it or lose it. Seriously though, I do hope that you'll find time to use your supplies up well before their expiration dates. And feel free to share this video with your art-loving friends. While you're at it, give them a little kick in the pants if they tend to collect art supplies more than they use them. Before I go, I have a short story to share with you. When my grandma was still living, she gave my cousins and I each a set of very old china that she'd had for decades. She told us that her regret when it came to these beautiful sets was that she had kept them away in storage, always waiting for that special occasion. And some of the sets, including the one that she passed down to me, never actually got used. So she told us to use them and enjoy them, special occasion or not. Don't keep them hidden away for another 30 or 40 years. And I thought of this conversation recently when I was making this video. So my daughter and I, we decided that next weekend we're going to make a nice spread of finger sandwiches, appetizers, and whatever else we feel like making. And we are breaking out the fine china. Your paints and your pencils should be living the colorful lives they were intended to live. Let's make sure that happens. Thank you so much for watching.